Now, at the beginning of the reign of James I in 1603, the little tiny villages of Austerfield, Babworth, Scrooby, the larger town of Gainsborough, even the country house down at Boxtow Hall down there in Nottinghamshire, were all centres where leading, gifted, godly separatist preachers were engaged in ministry and where groups were meeting secretly. In particular, by 1607, the believers based at Scrooby had been persecuted almost to breaking point, and hence that first pitiful failed escape attempt when they walked across land down to Boston, tried to escape from Fishtoft, but were arrested. The next year they tried again. This time they walked from their villages round here up to the Humber River and attempted to escape from Killingholm, a creek off the Humber River. Again, the authorities apprehended them. About half of them this time were arrested. The rest escaped. Then during the following summer, in ones and twos, they all managed to make it over to the Netherlands and found religious freedom over there. But although they had religious freedom, once they'd got to the Netherlands, troubles beset them again. And some dared to nurture the vision of moving right away altogether from Europe. What if they could settle in a new land where there would be freedom to establish a new community? And they began planning a far more dramatic journey than that first journey from England over to the Netherlands. They began planning the long sea journey over the Atlantic to America, and they were, of course, the Pilgrim Fathers. Now, in this talk, we're just going to consider these questions. Firstly, why did some believers feel compelled in their conscience to separate from the Church of England, and how did their situation become intolerable? Secondly, what was distinctive about those particular Puritans in that so-called Puritan quadrilateral, that area where Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire and Yorkshire meet? Why was it made difficult for them to emigrate? Why was it so hard to escape? Here we'll go back and look a little bit in more detail at those two escape attempts. And finally, we'll glance over at what happened to them when they got to the Netherlands and a tiny bit of the background to the sailing of the Mayflower in 1620. But before we start, just to clarify, that sailing of the Mayflower in 1620 was very different to the later, larger group of Puritans who left again from Boston, this Puritan area, for New England in 1630, different altogether. It was on the 1630 voyage that Governor Winthrop famously said that he hoped their godly settlement would shine like a city set on a hill for the whole world to see. Now that's a separate and later an epic drama. Now firstly, why did some believers feel compelled in their conscience to leave the Church of England, and how did their situation become intolerable? Now to answer that question, we actually have to rewind and look at some earlier religious exiles. During the reign of Queen Mary, from 1553 to 1558, John Foxe says about 800 leading doctors of divinity, clergy and bishops left England. It could have been many more, we just don't know, but many religious exiles from England ended up in the reformed centres of the Upper Rhine and Switzerland, particularly the cities of Zurich and Geneva. About a quarter of all those Marian exiles ended up in Geneva, where of course they set to work to translate the Bible, hence the Geneva Bible, the English translation made in Geneva. And they delighted in those reformed centres to experience what they believed was pure biblical worship, free of the organisation of the Catholic Church, the episcopacy, but also free from what they regarded as the unbiblical rituals of the Catholic Church in church worship and practice. Now these exiles grieved when news came across of their co-religionists in England being arrested, tortured, imprisoned, burned at the stake. Famously, nearly 300 men, women and children were burned at the stake for their beliefs during the reign of Mary. And of course, when the news came over of Mary's death, which had happened on the 17th of November 1558, they were overjoyed and they set off back to England. But when they got back, many of their bright hopes for religious reform would be disappointed. Queen Elizabeth was determined to steer a middle way between rival religious convictions. And the Elizabethan settlement meant that the Church of England would broadly follow Protestant theology, doctrine, things like justification, salvation. But when it came to practice, both in terms of organisation, episcopacy or bishops, and ritual, it would in many ways largely remain Catholic. The Act of Supremacy called for all taking office in church or state to swear allegiance to the monarch as supreme governor of the church, and anyone refusing could be charged with treason. The Act of Uniformity reintroduced Cranmer's second prayer book, but with some changes to placate the traditionalists. So, for example, ministers had to wear caps and white linen surplices. Now, you might think, what's wrong with that? Well, that shouted papist ideas about priestly sacrifice, reenacting the once-for-all sacrifice of Christ to any who'd imbibed those reformed convictions over in Geneva. One minister called the surplice a polluted and cursed mark of the beast, and marked that by the use of such rags of Antichrist, people would fall into a second popery. Ministers had to make the sign of the cross at baptism. Well, papal superstition, thought the reformers. Worshippers had to kneel at Holy Communion. Well, that just screamed out ideas of reverencing the host, which brought back again all those ideas of reenacting the sacrifice of Christ. But the Act of Uniformity ruled that a minister using any other form of service should for the first offence lose a year's income and be imprisoned for 6 months. Second offence, be deprived of his benefice, and third offence, life imprisonment. As far as the laity were concerned, absence from public services would mean a hefty fine. Now, those clergy who ultimately would become known as Puritans couldn't in their conscience conform to ceremonies and liturgy that they believed were not found in Scripture, because they believed that to be idolatrous and blasphemous. There was a strong sense of the fear of God, and you remember that story in the Old Testament where one who touched the ark was killed, that sense of the fear of God, reverencing God in worship. It was felt to be wrongful and blasphemous to introduce anything that was not condoned by Scripture. The Geneva Bible, the translation finished in 1560, became the most popular translation. It was the Bible taken on the Mayflower by the Pilgrims. And the Geneva Bible was a study Bible. I've got a section of the original 1560 Bible there, and down the sides are all the marginal notes explaining the biblical text. And so when you go through the Old Testament, the references to idolatry, the worship of Baal and Moloch and so forth, the marginal notes draw direct parallels between the idol worship and papal ritual. So you can see that ministers are going to be absolutely committed to not engaging in what they regard as idolatry. Just as influential, second most popular book in the English language, Fox's Book of Martyrs, or more correctly, Acts and Monuments, published 1563, popularised the idea that the Pope, who lay behind the imprisonment, the burning, the torture of true believers, was the Antichrist, and that Popish ritual was blasphemous, the equivalent of child sacrifice to Moloch. Now, those who pushed the Elizabethan settlement through, the court reformers, did believe in the final authority of Scripture. Yeah, they did, but in matters of doctrine. As far as practice was concerned, well, you can go to wisdom, tradition, common sense, and the civil magistrate. Those who became known as Puritans, by contrast, maintained that both in doctrine and practice, Scripture was the only final supreme authority. And nothing in practice as well as doctrine should be imposed as necessary which had not been expressly commanded in Scripture. Well, if you've got that, we now need to make another distinction. Okay? Among those Puritans, we divide again. Some of those Puritans believed that the Church of England was insufficiently reformed, but it was reformed enough to be regarded as a true church. So you could stay within it to work for reform from within. Others, in their conscience, felt that the Church of England was so contaminated that it was a false church, and these felt compelled on conscientious grounds to withdraw. Okay? Now, one could say a lot more about that, but I'll just mention the touch point of surplices. March the 26th, 1566, all the clergy of London were summoned to Lambeth Palace, and I've got a first-hand account here. They found themselves in presence of their bishop, their archbishop, and a life-size dummy canonically habited in a square-capped scholar's gown, tippet and surplice. Whereupon the bishop's chancellor called each minister forward with this counsel: be brief, make no words, sign, volo, willing to wear exactly that, or nolo, unwilling. Faced with this abrupt alternative concerning priestly apparel, 36 ministers wrote nolo and were immediately suspended from their office, and some were reduced to great poverty. Conscientious dissenters began meeting in secret. So, for example, 4th of March 1567, 72 believers gathered secretly in the Plumbers' Hall in London for a communion service and preaching. Sheriffs broke in, arrested the lot of them, took them all to Bridewell prison, and told them to sign that they would not engage in unofficial worship again. Those who signed that were released, but 24 men and 7 women refused to sign, and they were kept imprisoned in vile conditions in Bridewell for a year. Fast forward to 1576, the Queen ordered a crackdown on prophesying, because prophesying was the Puritan word for preaching. And one of the most common ways of expressing Puritan faith and devotion was to organise lectureships or preaching meetings, which could happen in various contexts outside of the official services. But that's where godly men were expanding the scriptures to believers. But now this was absolutely forbidden, and yet that was at the heart of Puritan devotion. I want to shift scene over to Bury St Edmunds, which was a sort of centre of reform belief. 1583, somewhat unwisely, one particular religious enthusiast went in and defaced some of the panels in the parish church with some somewhat apposite words from the book of Revelation about the whore Jezebel. Now, as you can imagine, the vicar, Richard Bancroft, who was later to be Archbishop of Canterbury, was not best pleased, and he set about hunting down possible culprits. Well, he ended up ordering the arrest and laying charges against 40 people, but then he was incandescent when he found that many of those people had been reading books by the first separatist, Robert Brown. Well, he ordered that all books by Brown should be seized and burned, but worse, when a shoemaker called John Coppin and a tailor called Elias Thacker were found to have been distributing those books, they were hanged. 10 years later, back in London, 1593, convinced separatists Henry Barrow and John Greenwood were also hanged after several years of imprisonment in desperately harsh conditions. That same year, 1593, when Parliament met, a law banned all private religious gatherings of any kind. That could include anything. All private religious gatherings were banned. And those who did not attend the Church of England for 40 days and who attended private services were to be imprisoned until they conformed to the Church. So to summarise, most Puritans actually hoped to cooperate with lawful authorities and work for reforming the Church from within. But there were separatists who were willing to defy the law of the land, renounce their membership of the Church of England, and secretly establish independent congregations, gatherings of believers, gathered churches. But for doing so, these people faced fines, imprisonment, or possible death, and they weren't even allowed to run away. At this time, under English law, emigration was not a right, but it was a privilege, and it was a privilege routinely denied to so-called enemies of the state, such as Roman Catholics and Protestant dissenters. So, I think we've answered that first question. It was impossible in conscience to stay, and it was impossible to leave. Elizabeth died on the 24th of March 1603, and her successor was King James I, 6th of Scotland, 1st of England. And at first the Puritans had high hopes of their new monarch. 1,000 of them signed the so-called millenary petition that they gave over to the new king, calling for reform. Now, James played for time by convening the famous Hampton Court Conference in 1604, which was the conference which commissioned the translation of the Bible, which became known as the King James or Authorised Bible. James was utterly opposed to religious dissent of any kind, and times became harder and harsher for those who in conscience could not worship in their parish churches. We're going to ask, secondly, what was distinctive about the Puritans in this particular area of England? Now, in this remote area, during the reign of Elizabeth, actually, clergy who'd refused to conform in various ways to the Church of England had been left relatively unmolested. And groups of believers who met secretly had again also been able to meet relatively unmolested. And so for nearly 20 years, since 1585, the minister in this particular place, Babworth, was a man called Richard Clifton, and he had been educated at Cambridge, as many Puritans did, got his reformed views at Cambridge. But from 1585 onwards, he was preaching biblical reformed truth and not conforming to everything in that particular church, and he was left alone. And believers walked from miles around to hear his ministry. And one believer who walked for miles was a man called William Brewster, who walked from Scrooby, the 7 miles down to Babworth and back every Sunday. Now, William Brewster was from a well-off family. His father, in fact, had been the bailiff of the Archbishop of York. And the bailiff of the Archbishop of York, based in Scrooby, had the job of administering the estates of the Archbishop in that area, collecting his rents, but also acting as innkeeper and postmaster of Scrooby. Now, Scrooby now only has 300 inhabitants, and it was tiny then, but it was incredibly strategic, because at that point in time there was one road from London to Scotland, the Great North Road, and it went through Scrooby. So 24 hours a day, the innkeeper at Scrooby would be having servants ready to provide changes of horse, accommodation, food for travellers. A very strategic location. Now, William Brewster's father had those duties, and he lived in the Archbishop's manor house in Scrooby. That sounds very grand. Well, way back in 1207, King John had stayed with the Archbishop of York in the manor house at Scrooby on his way up to Scotland. And at that point, the manor house at Scrooby had been a grand palace. But by this time, late 1500s, early 1600s, it was no longer a grand palace. It had fallen into disrepair. The Archbishop of York hardly went near it, but his bailiff lived there, and it was the base for the Great North Road. So that's where William Brewster's father lived. Now, William Brewster Jr. went to Cambridge to study, got converted, got his reform convictions, and he got a job with a leading diplomat over in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, he gained diplomatic experience, military experience, and experience of worshipping in reformed congregations in greater freedom than in England. Now, William Brewster had been baptised in the church that we just had up there just now, the church at Scrooby. But he chose not to worship in the parish church at Scrooby because there was not a biblical ministry there. Now, his own father was well known in the local area for abusing his servant girls. He was a lecherous and immoral man. But he would just worship there in Scrooby Parish Church along with everybody else. And one of the things that convinced believers objected to was the way that open known sinners would just freely take communion, be part of the church, all together in what they called a profane mixture. And so rather than worship there, William Brewster would walk willingly the 7 miles down from Scrooby to Babworth to hear a biblical ministry from Richard Clifton. And so did his young protege, William Bradford. Now, William Bradford was born up in Austerfield, just over the border in South Yorkshire, and he would walk from Austerfield right down to Babworth to hear preaching at the young age of 12. Now, Bradford is a fascinating character. He came from a well-off family in Austerfield, but he was orphaned at a very young age and passed round from relative to relative. And as they died off, he ran out of relatives to go to. When he was 12, he fell seriously ill and read the Bible and was powerfully converted. And from that age, he was committed to walking down those miles to Austerfield to hear Richard Clifton preach. But on the way, of course, he'd walk through Scrooby, and he'd often walk with the Brewsters and other believers from Scrooby he walked down. And so when his relatives persecuted him and his neighbours mocked him, and this young lad was effectively thrown out of his village community for being a true believer, William Brewster at Scrooby took him in and gave him a home with his family. So Richard Clifton's ministry down in Austerfield is drawing believers from Scrooby. Richard's ministry in Babworth is drawing believers from Scrooby, from Austerfield, and a radius around. But after the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, James I cracks down on reformed clergy. They've given in a load of demands. He says no to most of them, and about 80 clergy in 1604 were ejected from their livings, including Richard Clifton. He lost his living at Austerfield, and he was jobless and he was homeless. So what did William Brewster do? Of course, he offered Clifton and his family refuge at the manor house at Scrooby. And so we now have a situation where unofficial worship services are taking place in the manor house, which actually belongs to the Archbishop of York. Lovely irony. They're taking place in Scrooby, but also unofficial worship services are taking place just over the Lincolnshire border in Lincolnshire in this place called Gainsborough. And I want us to turn and consider Gainsborough for a minute, because this is also significant in separatist history. Gainsborough Old Hall is a magnificent manor house built between 1465 and 1490. But in 1595, that manor house was bought by the wealthy Hickman family, who were of Reformed persuasion. In fact, they'd been among the Marian exiles over on the continent. And the Hickman family were known to be sympathetic to the separatist cause. So, when the Bishop of Lincoln in 1602 sacked the official preacher of Lincoln, who was a man called John Smith, that man, John Smith, was able to take refuge in Gainsborough along with 60 or 70 of his followers, and the believers from Lincoln here moved up to Gainsborough and began meeting unofficially in the Hickman's residence, the Old Hall. Now, John Smith, we could say a lot more about him, but he was born in the tiny village of Sturton-le-Steeple down here, little village, and a whole bunch of leading Reformed people were born in that village. There must have been something in the water, I think. But anyway, John Smith went to Gainsborough Grammar School and then down to Cambridge to study, converted at Cambridge, came to Reformed convictions, became a strong preacher, got the job of official preacher of Lincoln, but then was sacked by the bishop in 1602 because he was way too Reformed. He took his believing followers down to Gainsborough. Now, this group of believers disagreed with ceremonies, with prescribed liturgies, with the numerous holy days that the church imposed that they didn't find in the Bible anywhere. But for them, arguably the greatest evil was the practice of forcing all residents of England to become members of the Church of England, which resulted, as they said, in a profane mixture in the worship of God. They believed that church membership should be based on profession of faith and repentance. And so at Gainsborough, this group of believers made a covenant to walk together with the Lord, following him in all his ways. And that covenant was with the Lord and with each other. I'm just going to mention one of John Smith's friends who joined them at Gainsborough, Thomas Helwys. We haven't got time to go into him now, but an incredibly important figure because he was the first person to fully articulate in English the idea of religious toleration. Landmark book, The Mystery of Iniquity, which he had the cheek to present personally to James I, and for that he was killed in 1612. But Thomas Helwys came from Boxdale Hall, a wealthy family down here in Nottinghamshire, and he and his wife Joan used Boxdale Hall as again a meeting for separatist believers. But they ultimately joined the believers up in Gainsborough. But having cleaned Lincoln up of heresy, it had effectively gone down to Gainsborough. The Bishop of Lincoln thought that he should clean up Gainsborough next, so he turned his eye upon Gainsborough. And the Bishop of Lincoln started putting pressure on that wealthy Hickman family to stop using their home for separatist gatherings. And the pressure was such that in 1607, the believers at Gainsborough did actually manage successfully to escape to Amsterdam, where they started an English-speaking separatist congregation. So we go back to Scrooby. These believers have not yet escaped to the Netherlands. And Scrooby, being in, is actually, I think, under the watch of the Archbishop of York. The Archbishop of York begins looking down on them and saying, right, I'd want to finish off, end off what's going on there. Interestingly, until 1606, the Archbishop of York had been a Puritan sympathiser, and he just sort of kind of turned a blind eye, left them alone. But he's succeeded by a man called Tobias Matthew, who is definitely not willing to turn a blind eye to what is going on in Scrooby. He summoned William Brewster up to York. He fined William Brewster £40, which may not sound very much, but it was at least £4,000 in today's money, and deprived him of his job. And from this point on, Brewster was a marked man, and it meant that the position of believers meeting in Scrooby Manor was no longer going to be tenable. They had to try and escape. Now, before we move to those escape attempts, just to summarise the situation, we've got two prongs of opposition for the believers in Scrooby and elsewhere, but we'll focus in on the Scrooby believers. There's the official opposition, threats of imprisonment. Actually, in the back of their minds, they could be killed. Why was that happening? Well, as far as officials were concerned, religious dissent was not a purely private religious matter. At that time, separatists, in their view, were attacking the legal authority of the church, which had implications to officialdom of political rebellion as well. That's why the stakes are so high. But as well as official opposition, there is informal pressure from the local community. Friends and neighbours regarded religious dissenters as a threat and a nuisance. And believers had to face hostility, sneering, backbiting, false accusations, and the daily nagging, scoffing, deriding was actually just as much a pressure pushing them to leave as the threats coming down from above. Hence, the believers at Scrooby willing to brave the unknowns of a risky journey and a foreign culture. And so now with that context, let's look back at those two abortive escape attempts that I mentioned right at the beginning. The believers at Scrooby want to leave, but how are they going to do that? They're not allowed to officially. There's another slight problem. William Brewster's wife Mary was expecting a baby, and they wouldn't be able to leave until the baby was born. Well, the infant was safely delivered in 1607 and tellingly given the name Fear, little girl called Fear. Almost immediately after that, they decided to set out and try and make their escape. So, in the middle of the night, a group of families, including William and Brewster Mary, with Jonathan aged 13, Patience aged 7, and little baby Fear, John and Bridget Robinson with little Anne and John, toddlers, Richard and Anne Clifton with Eliezer aged 7, Timothy aged 10, Zachariah aged 16, and William Bradford, who by then was probably 18, plus others, ran away on foot with what they could carry. They had to camp rough at night, were in fear of arrest, and they basically walked the 60 miles from Scrooby down to Boston. And when they got to Boston, they'd engaged a sea captain to pick them up in a secret place at Fishtoft, where the River Haven comes in, and hopefully to make their escape down to the Netherlands. Well, it was a pretty miserable journey, as you can imagine, from Scrooby down to Boston. The nights were cold, the nights were drawing in. It was not an easy journey. When they got to Boston, they had to find their way down to Fishtoft, and I'll let William Bradford pick up the story in his first-hand account of Plymouth Plantation. After long waiting, he writes, and great expense, the captain had not kept day with them. He came at last and took them aboard at night. But when he had secured them and their goods, he betrayed them, having arranged beforehand with the officers and searchers to do so. They then put them in open boats and ransacked and rifled them, searching them to their shirts for money, and even the women, further than became modesty, and took them back to the town, Boston, and made a spectacle of them to the multitude that came flocking from all sides to see them. Being thus rifled and stripped of their money, books, and other property, they were brought before the magistrates. After a month's imprisonment, the majority were dismissed and sent back to the places whence they came, but 7 of the leaders were kept in prison and bound over to the assizes. While the pastors of the group, John Robinson, Richard Clifton, and William Brewster, were the last to be released. And the group simply had to try and find refuge with friends and families until they could try to escape again. They'd sold up their homes. In the spring of 1608, they did try again. Now, this time they made contact with a Dutch sea captain who they hoped would not betray them to the authorities as the English one had done. And the Dutch sea captain agreed to pick them up from the River Humber up here. And this time, it was felt that the women and children simply couldn't attempt the long walk as they had the first time. So the women and children plus possessions were put on a small boat up the River Idle, up to the Humber, while the menfolk attempted the 40 or 50 miles, about 40 miles I think maybe, from Scrooby and the surrounding villages up to Killingholme. But that separation was to prove utterly disastrous. Both groups got there before the Dutch captain, and the small boat on which the women and children and goods had been transported was sort of hidden away in a little creek where it would be unnoticed by the authorities. But that little boat was then grounded when the tide went out. And before the tide could come in to release that little boat, the Dutch sea captain had come along to the other part of the shore and begun picking up the men who'd walked to a meeting point there. And I will let William Bradford again pick up the account of what happens next. As soon as the first group of men were on board the Dutch ship, the captain espied a large body of horse and foot armed with bills and guns and other weapons, for the whole countryside had turned out to capture them. The Dutchmen, on seeing this, swore, and having a fair wind, weighed anchor, hoist sail, and away. The poor men already aboard were in deep distress for their wives and children, left thus to be captured and destitute of help, and for themselves too, without any clothes but what they had on their backs, and scarcely a penny about them, all their possessions being on the bark, now seized by the authorities. It drew tears from their eyes, and they would have given anything to be on shore again, but all in vain. There was no remedy. They must thus sadly part. Well, Bradford then goes on to give an amazing, vivid first-hand description of the terrible storm which took that boat carrying the men, up to the north coast, up to the North Sea to Norway, and the ship was nearly wrecked, but it finally made it back to the Netherlands after 2 weeks. And he then picks up the story back on the Humber, but to return to the rest where we left them. Sufficient men stayed to assist the women, but it was pitiful to see the poor women in their distress. What weeping and crying on every side, some for their husbands carried away in the ship, others not knowing what would become of them and their little ones, others again melted in tears, seeing their poor little ones hanging about them, crying for fear and quaking with cold. Being thus apprehended, they were hurried about from one place to another, till in the end the officers knew not what to do with them. For to imprison so many innocent women and children only because they wished to go with their husbands seemed unreasonable. To be short, they were glad to be rid of them. Bradford then goes on, I will pass by other troubles which they endured in their wanderings and travels both on land and sea. In the end they all got over to the Netherlands and met together with no small rejoicing. Well, there you go. 2 failed escape attempts. 2 terrifying experiences. Why? What was that all about? Well, with hindsight, Bradford, strong believer in the sovereignty of God, did reflect, and he said, For by these public afflictions their cause became famous, and led many to inquire into it, and their Christian behaviour left a deep impression on the minds of many. So eventually about 125 of this group were reunited over in Amsterdam by the summer of 1608, the final ones just going over in 1s and 2s as they could. Now, there were already 2 English separatist congregations in Amsterdam, and the Scrooby group decided to move to Leiden, the second largest city in Holland, and within 10 years this group numbered over 400, their pastor being the godly and gifted John Robinson. But while they enjoyed freedom from religious persecution, life in Leiden presented new threats. A problem for many of them was just survival. Now, some of the more educated men found good employment, including at the University of Leiden. But for many others, the language barrier, lack of urban experience, they just had to find what work they could. And for many that meant working very long hours of menial labour in the textile industry and other industries. And so Bradford writes, For though they saw fair and beautiful cities, overflowing with all sorts of abundance and wealth, it was not long before they saw the grim and grisly face of poverty coming upon them like an armed man. He's a great writer. It's a great read of Plymouth Plantation. Now, some of the exiles even had to send their young children out to work, as in the English Industrial Revolution. And children were weakened as they aged prematurely through hard labour and poor diet. But much worse, the young people were then exposed to the pressures and temptations of a new and foreign culture. And they were losing their language and their identity, and even in some cases, their faith. And it wasn't even as if this place offered permanent security. There was the real danger that if Spain, as was threatened, would regain control of the Netherlands, then religious freedom would end. And the separatists would be back not under the persecuting power of the Church of England, but under the persecuting power of Rome. And so their thoughts turned to America. Back in 1607, the year of their first failed escape, that had been the very same year that a trading company, the London Virginia Company, had sent a group of settlers from England to the area that Sir Walter Raleigh had named Virginia after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth. And these settlers founded Jamestown, an English colony under the Charter of James I, Jamestown. And as an English colony, of course, the Church of England was the established church with attendance at the parish church compulsory. But what if some of the laden believers could go over to that colony but settle far enough away from Jamestown to be left alone and unmolested? This was really the only scenario they could imagine and think of. But some were more ambitious. In the words of William Bradford, some of them dared to nurture the great hope for the propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. In other words, they had a missionary motivation as well. What if they could go over and spread the gospel in a new continent? Big thoughts. Well, early in 1619, the Leyden Church sent two of their members over to London, two men with business experience, to try and negotiate with the Virginia Company. If a group from Leyden was going to settle over in America, two things would be necessary. One, they would need financial backing for the expense of the voyage and setting up a settlement. But two, they'd need official permission to actually go over there, and hopefully included in the official permission some sort of guarantee of freedom of worship. Well, the negotiations were just endlessly difficult, horrendously difficult. On the financial level, the investor who eventually backed them kept changing his terms and conditions. But on the permission side, while they managed to secure permission to sail over to Virginia and settle, they weren't able to get any form of cast iron guarantee of religious toleration. But they decided they just had to risk it and go and hope that they'd be out of people's way. Now, initially the thought was that a minority of the Leyden congregation would go ahead to America. They'd leave the old and the young in Holland because the initial conditions would be too harsh. So couples would left their little children in Holland. The pastor, John Robinson, and his family stayed, cared for the old and the young, but some of the strong, a small group, would go over and try and make a settlement, and then, as possible, the rest would follow. They bought a small ship called the Speedwell. The Leyden congregation bought a small ship called the Speedwell, initially to transport the families who were going to go over with their goods, first to London and then to Southampton, where they would meet up with a larger ship called the Mayflower, which would have the rest of the settlers being sent over by the financial backer to make up the colony over to America. Now, only a total of 35 of the Leyden congregation went, which meant that once the financial backers had packed the Mayflower with other settlers to make the settlement viable, they were a minority. So you've got 102 passengers, 35 pilgrims, and the rest were so-called strangers. You've also got 35 crew. The beginning of the voyage was utterly traumatic because the Speedwell and the Mayflower set off from Southampton, but the Speedwell proved to be utterly seaworthy, and it actually looked as if it had been sabotaged for people to get investment. They'd effectively been cheated. The two ships had to return and repack everything onto the Mayflower. Some people dropped out at that point, but they all jammed on the Mayflower, the rest who were going to go. And that total group endured 65 long days at sea in cramped and grim conditions with violent storms. Amazingly, and in contrast to similar voyages, on that 65-day voyage, only 2 people died, which was pretty good going for those days, and 1 baby was born, given the lovely name of Oceanus, most appropriate. But the ship was blown way off course, 200 miles north of where they wanted to be in Virginia. And because it was late in the year, they'd been delayed by these endless problems with the financial backer and the problem of the Speedwell, etc. It was too late in the year to make their way down to Virginia, and they finally had to just stop at Cape Cod. But when they got there, they couldn't find a suitable place to disembark and settle. For 6 more miserable weeks, the majority of them were on the Mayflower, while men in a smaller boat went up and down the coast trying to find a place to disembark and settle. And eventually they settled on landing at Plymouth, present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts. By this time, tensions were rising, disagreements surfacing, people quarrelling. So before they disembarked, every adult passenger set their signature to the famous Mayflower Compact, a covenant to work together for the common good. December 23rd, 1620, all who were able went ashore, began constructing basic shelters. That first winter, weakened by the harsh conditions of the 3-month voyage, 52 of the 102 passengers died, including 14 of the 26 heads of families. And of the 18 married couples, only 3 married couples survived, both of them intact. Only strong faith in God, unremitting hard work, some friendly help from some native local Americans, inspiring leadership from William Brewster, William Bradford, and an ex-army Captain Miles Standish enabled that group to survive. 10 years later, the Plymouth colony was only 300 people, and it would be vastly outnumbered by the much larger Puritan emigrations over to Massachusetts Bay, a little bit further north. But it's the Mayflower Pilgrims, those Mayflower Pilgrims, who are popularly remembered as the founders of American democracy. And looking back on that momentous journey, which for him began in that tiny village of Austerfield, William Bradford concluded his book, "Thus out of small beginnings, greater things have been produced by his hand that made all things out of nothing, and gives being to all things that are. And as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone to many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation. Let the glorious name of Jehovah have all the praise."